It's ironic, it's wonderful. The 2 episodes that I have done thus far on What We Do in the Shadows turned out to be some of the only ones that didn't have any action. And I was so happy about it. I really, really was. It would have been more comfortable for me to do action, to do what I know. Absolutely, it would have been, but I don't want to be in my comfort zone. If your heart is not in your mouth, you're not challenging yourself.
Welcome to Wider Lens, a podcast brought to you by the Directors Guild of Canada in Ontario. Today, I'm joined by Emmy-nominated stunt coordinator and DGC Ontario director Tig Fong.
It was 10 years of in the background. I wouldn't tell people necessarily what my objective was at first. Then I just started dropping hints like, yeah, I want to direct. But that 10 years was 10 years of honing the craft.
Tig's journey has taken some interesting twists and turns. They began their career in stunts 30 years ago, where they discovered a notable lack of diversity in the industry. From there, they had a mission to challenge the status quo. Tig has earned nearly 100 credits as a stunt performer, coordinator, and choreographer on productions like 300, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, The Boys, and most recently, all 5 seasons of What We Do in the Shadows.
Punches and kicks are words, and combinations are phrases or paragraphs, and the pauses in between is the moment that the audience gets to reflect on that.
What We Do in the Shadows is a critically acclaimed mockumentary comedy horror series on FX about 4 vampire roommates and their human bodyguard interacting with the modern world. What We Do in the Shadows is also where Tig went from stunt coordinator to second unit director. Eventually, they began helming full episodes as a director on seasons 3 and 4. This year, the show was nominated for 7 Emmys, including Outstanding Comedy Series and Tig's first Emmy nom for Outstanding Stunt Coordination. Today, we're chatting with Tig about breaking barriers as a queer person of color.
I had no idea that I would actually learn to accept myself better, that I would investigate and unpack my own internalized homophobia as to why I didn't come out. There was a lot to be gained as a person.
And navigating bias and expectation. We also touch on how action shapes storytelling, how it influenced their vision as a director, and what they're doing to make their corner of the industry a more equitable place. I'm Annie Bradley, and this is Wider Lens. Well, I'm very excited that you're here because today we are going to talk about journey, the journey. And I think that the journey is one of the most underrated discussions in the film industry, sometimes overlooked. I really feel the importance of the journey is that there are the lessons that we learn, the missteps that we make along the way, and the realization that it is not about the outcome, which is always judged more by others, but about the fact that we continue to try and we get up and go back at it every day. And so I guess what I'd really love to do is talk to you about the origin of your journey.
Ooh, that's reaching way back. I grew up in the east coast of Canada, so Halifax to be precise. A lot of racism there, history of it, a lot of racial violence in my life. Growing up as a racialized child, I'm Asian Pacific Islander, by the way, but the people that adopted me, I'm adopted, were Chinese. So I was raised as Chinese.
I'm adopted.
Ah, well, there you go. We're in the same club.
Yes.
But yeah, no Asian community to speak of. So there wasn't that kind of support, just my immediate family. So looking for role models in sports and in television and in film, there just weren't any. Unless, of course, we talk about Hong Kong film, which is where I discovered my strong, Asian male, because that's what I was raised as in the first place, but characters in the form of martial arts heroes like Bruce Lee and Jet Li. And watching them, look strong and stand up for themselves, which is what I think I so desperately wanted for myself, but couldn't do. They are who I idolized, and that created two wants. And one was to do martial arts, much to the chagrin of my parents. They didn't care for that, and the other one was to do it in film in specific. But fast forward a couple decades, and I did fumble slash stumble my way into actually working in film, doing special skills extra stuff, martial arts, and then eventually becoming a bona fide stunt performer.
I think this is interesting because there's two things here. You're talking about the lack of representation. And so you're having to look abroad for, role models, just even people that, that you can aspire to be like, or that, are giving you sort of a sense of representation. And then you found a way through martial arts and you find a way into the film industry.
I will say that I'm thankful for the stunt industry. I'm thankful to have been able to go into it. I'm thankful to still be a part of it. Although how I am a part of it now is changing in terms of what I am doing and what I want to do in future. But the interesting thing is that growing up as a racialized child and young adult and what have you, and then finally finding myself, in the film industry, there was an irony there that was hard to stomach at times, which is the fact that I voluntarily entered a field where you can choose me or not choose me on the basis of the color of my skin. To illustrate, I just mean, like, for instance, there's no work for me all year until there's a movie with Asian gangs in it. They didn't care whether it was Yakuza, which is Japanese, or whether it was Triads, which is Chinese. It's not so interchangeable now, which is probably a good thing. Well, no, it is a good thing. But before, it was very interchangeable. So I could play any yellow person, let's just call it as it is, right? And that's why I would wait for those roles, and I would happily work those roles when I got them, because the only other choice was to not work at all. But over time, there were times when I didn't feel good about it, because it's like, well, if I am all these things living in normal society, I don't live in Chinatown, I'm not a member of an Asian gang. Why do I only come out when those things happen? So was it all that I hoped and dreamed it would be? No, it was a part-time job at best, working maybe a dozen days a year for like a decade or so. It was, so that meant that I had to have multiple jobs in order to survive.
You started to become a fight choreographer, and you started to have this skill that people could not deny, which sort of changed that paradigm, from working a little bit a year to becoming much more in demand, right? Could you talk a little bit about that journey too, which leads to, stunt coordination, et cetera?
When I finally got the chance to be at first a fight choreographer and then a fight coordinator, I do differentiate them. I realize that people use them interchangeably. It was an opportunity to show what I knew and show or utilize the skill sets that I had accrued over decades of training, a lifetime of training. The skills that I wasn't permitted to use as a performer, I was now able to incorporate into my work and show that work. And yeah, there's a couple things about that. One is just an appreciation of story, because I always felt like, starting as fight scenes, I always felt that fights on camera were nonverbal dialogue, nonverbal conversations. My approach, being informed by that, did seem to make a difference, because I really cared about what the characters were saying to each other when they stopped talking and started fighting, right? Punches and kicks are words, and combinations are phrases or paragraphs, and the pauses in between is the moment that the audience gets to reflect on that.
What was the moment? What was that key moment where you realized, I want to do this. I want to go beyond what I'm doing now, and I want to do something even scarier for myself? I mean, when was that moment?
Yeah, scarier is right. So that takes us back, and I'm glad you asked. That takes us back to like 10 years to Nikita, the series. I was working on that as a fight coordinator. Um, and at that point, it was around that time when the standard of previs started to become a thing, like all across film and television, where directors or producers wanted to see a pre-visualization of the action that is being proposed. What they really wanted to see was the movie before the movie. So on Nikita, when I was being interviewed and I was, eventually hired as the fight coordinator on that show, the producer, the line producer said, well, are you able to shoot previs? Do you know how to do that? Because, our previous person, they shot little movies. And I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that. I was literally doing the actor thing. Can you ride a horse? Yeah, sure I can. And then as soon as you get off the interview, you go out and book some horse interviews. And then this producer is like, well, we need you to, shoot the movie before the movie. I'm like, okay. And I literally went home and just kind of looked up how to use, editors and how to use my camera for something other than photography. So that's what started, me having to know how a movie is made, not just how to perform the action. And when I was doing a fight scene on an episode, it was, I think, 310. And Darren Sarafian was the director. And he saw my previs, which he very, very much liked. And he liked the style in which I shot and cut it. And we had a conversation one day, just, I think it was at lunch. And he goes, so what do you want to do? Like, what do you ultimately want to do? And I'm like, I don't know. If kind of liking this, maybe would like to direct maybe someday or direct second unit. And he said that he had the same conversation. John Hughes apparently asked him that question early in his career when he was either an AD or a PA or whatever. And, he had said, well, I want to be a director. And apparently John said to him, well, then you need to start calling yourself a director. Now, I didn't have the audacity to do that. And I was just like, okay, that's crazy talk, but sure. And then when it came time to do the fight scene that I had built for Darren on that episode, he's like, yeah, okay, you direct. I think I just almost soiled my pants, but I'm like, and then I'm like, well, I kind of rehearsed it because I did shoot the movie before the movie. I already knew what the camera positions were. I already know what the action, know what the cuts are for that matter. So I did direct on set. That was my first. But once I did that, I got to tell you, I was bit. I was bit by the bug. I was like, okay, I have to, how do I become a director? At least an action director.
Tell me how the offer came to do an episode and what that moment was like for you. Because it's a huge moment. It's wonderful.
It was 10 years of in the background. I wouldn't tell people necessarily what my objective was at first. And then I started to. Then I just started dropping hints like, yeah, I want to direct. Yeah, I want to direct. But that 10 years was 10 years of honing the craft. So I was honing my craft through previs for the most part. And then, of course, the times when I would get to second unit direct. In season 3, the show had wanted me, and they said, well, what do you want to come back? Because I'm like, well, now I have other offers. And I said I wanted to be officially a second unit director for the show. And they're like, okay, well, we're going to make that happen. And they did. It's a wonderful family here, I have to say. The people at FX and the Shadows family, I mean, they've just been nothing but supportive. And I'm so, so grateful for it because it matters. You can't do it on your own. And these people helped me into being a seasoned second unit director, which then helped me into the DGC, incidentally. That's when I joined.
Welcome.
Thank you. And then while I was doing that, midway through the season, we were using alternating directors, the lovely and talented Yana Gorskaya and Kyle Newacek. Kyle had to leave all of a sudden because he was a father-to-be, and it was with very short notice. And suddenly there was a panic because like, okay, but we're going to shoot in 2 days. Like, who could we bring in that could possibly get up to speed and understand the tone and language of the show, being a unique one, really. And like, well, and that's when it was my producers here, the line producers, um, Zach Hagen, Derek Rappaport, and said, well, why don't you use Tig? So the rest is history. With everyone sort of behind me, I directed my first episode of network TV.
Congratulations, because success is preparation meets opportunity, right? And you were ready, because that's a huge deal. So let's talk about this, because you just spoke about tone. And I think tone is another really interesting aspect of this journey, because you're moving from, you did The Boys as well, which has a very similar tone. It's kind of tongue in cheek, it's very cheeky, etc. And you move into What We Do in the Shadows, and it is an unusual tone. It is on the verge of camp, but it's wonderful and it's grounded. And yet there's some crazy stunts that happen in What We Do in the Shadows. There's a huge amount of flying work and people dropping through floors and turning into bats and all kinds of other crazy stuff. And I'm just wondering, because, we think about stunt work as very sort of, tough and violent. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how tone, how the approach to comedic tone in stunt work, how do you do that differently than, say, your regular kind of run-of-the-mill fight sequence?
My guiding question that I would ask of my co-coordinator, the very talented JF LaChapelle, the question would be, but is it funny? Because you have to go back to that. You have to ask yourself that question if you have a car hit. I mean, car hits. I do car hits all the time on other shows, and they're really they're usually sudden. It's a graphic kind of violence with serious repercussions to that individual usually. In our case, if you hit a vampire, they might just fall down and get up and go, hey, what the. And that's the point, is that what about the physicality is going to carry that comedic tone? And that's where it differs. But we have this huge fight scene between two of the lead characters, and there's so much stuff going on. There's wire work, there's fight work, there's weapons work. And yet it all sort of tells the story about the mismatch between them, but the comedy of the mismatch. And that you just have to keep going back to that question as you build each section of this piece of action. But is it funny?
Where do you see yourself? Do you feel that there's a perception when you go out and present yourself as a director to people that don't know your work? When they see your resume, do they always assume that you want to do action films as a director?
Absolutely. It's ironic. It's wonderful. The 2 episodes that I have done thus far on What We Do in the Shadows turned out to be some of the only ones that didn't have any action. I had 0 action in both of my episodes, and I was so happy about it. I really, really was. It would have been more comfortable for me to, do action, to do what I know. Absolutely, it would have been that those days, whatever days I would have been covering the action, I would have been in my comfort zone. But I don't want to be in my comfort zone. As much as I had my heart in my mouth. You're not making art if your heart is not in your mouth, and you're not challenging yourself if your heart isn't in your mouth. So yeah, I fully admit to being terrified. I'll be terrified again the next time I direct, because that's just what happens to me. Because I care, actually. I care about the project. I care about all the people that are involved in the project, and I understand that my position is to serve the project and not to let these people down.
So let's talk about diversity and inclusion a little bit. When did you sort of come out as a genderqueer person, and when did you feel that was there a hesitancy to do that?
First, I want to talk about why I didn't come out. I already talked about the scarcity of work for people of color. Once I got to the other side of the line and I saw what producers would ask for, or showrunners, they would say, well, make sure we have some Black people. Let's make sure we have some Hispanic people. Tell you what they never ask for is Asian males. But working in stunts in particular, you have to look at the origins of stunts. The origins of stunts is the first stunt performers were stunt men. They were cowboys, which are the epitome of cishet maleness. And not to knock them, I mean, there's all the things that come with it, which is like, the extremely tough and extremely, just ready to go type of thing. But, there's what else comes with that is obviously the, chauvinism and then through chauvinism, misogyny and homophobia and all that other stuff, right? I think because of that, the origins of it, stunts sort of became this pocket, whereas the film industry is known for being progressive. Mm-hmm. There's always more work to be done, as we all know, right? But it's always known to be, I feel that Hollywood's always been kind of a little bit on the leading edge of the society at large in terms of trying to push a little bit of progressivism. That's how I feel about it anyways. But I will say that stunts would be the laggard in this case. Just being a little bit more insulated. And like I said, the most stunt coordinators, which is the senior most position you can have in stunts, being cishet white men, not much was going to change. Men were hired preferentially all the time. Those men, are going to want to present as at least straight, there were at the time that I was working in stunts for the number of years, there were no queer people that I was aware of, except for one or two queer women who did identify as gay. There is it's unfounded, but there's a bias or a belief that, oh, okay, well then that she's one of the guys then. There's this unfounded expectation that she's going to be tougher than a regular woman. So therefore it's an asset perhaps that they be gay or that they be a lesbian. It doesn't hurt them. But the same is not true on the male side of it. If you are a male performer and you say, well, by the way, I'm gay or bi or whatever, or trans, suddenly the response would be, oh, well, then are you going to cry when you break a nail, right? And it's all inferred. Nobody says it out loud, but when you hear homophobic jokes, when you don't see a representation within your community, you can only assume that you're not welcome, or you wouldn't be welcome if you came out. I had been out for a number of years to close friends, my partners, but I didn't really have come out professionally, I guess, until 2018 when I was working on Titans. When I came out in 2018 working on Titans, I was having a bad day. I was just pissed off because I was just like, man, things just never freaking change in stunts. And then I'm like, wait a minute, I am a genderqueer person of color that is the stunt coordinator on, at that point, the biggest action show in the city. I would say that was changed. The problem is that I do realize that I am straight passing and cis passing. What remains would be for me to come out so that I can hold this space. And not that so everyone else who is not coming out and self-identifying within stunts to come out, because they're not going to just because I did, but just so that they know that they belong and that there's hope. Yes, it sounds very altruistic. Plot twist. I had no idea that it would benefit me, that I would actually learn to accept myself better, that I would investigate and unpack my own internalized homophobia as to why I didn't come out. There was a lot to be gained as a person. So I'm not going to hold myself up as this sort of martyr that did this incredibly altruistic thing. That is what I intended, but a lot more than that happened. I do feel that pressure though, as all children of immigrant parents have been told by their parents, is that you need to work twice as hard to have half as much as white people. And I've always held that in my heart. It felt true to me. It still feels true to me. And now being out as genderqueer, person of color, trying to, still work in the various wearing the hats that I do, I still feel that I have to be an exemplar of excellence
I think that's a feeling that is held by a lot of people, a lot of marginalized people that are in the industry. You're obviously a trailblazer in the community in many ways, which I think is really exciting. And the show is definitely a reflection of that. So, what would you like to do next with this career?
Well, I do know action. I do have an appreciation for it. It's part of my craft, but I'd be more interested as an intersectionally marginalized person to tell the stories of intersectionally or marginalized people. So that is what I would like to do. I would like to, well, work on my own writing, but I'd love to work with queer and BIPOC writers, um, and help them tell their stories, direct those movies, tell those stories, which are probably, dramas, not action films at all. It doesn't tend to necessarily lend itself that way. It might be. I got a couple things I'm pitching that has that twist to it. It's a bit of action, it's a little bit of queer in it. Because why not, right? Because it's normal. It should be normal. It's weird that it's not normal in my mind, but I'm going to try and change that.
I want to thank you very much for being here. I'm so excited for you, for the Emmys, for the show, for what lies ahead for you. And I hope that this is the beginning of, many wonderful things to come. So thank you very much for coming.
Thanks so much, Annie. Thank you.
This podcast was produced by Katie Jensen and Michal Stein at Vocal Fry Studios. Our video producer is John Packman. Our executive producer is Anne-Marie Stewart. And special thanks to Aviva Cohen and Laura DiGirolamo at DGC Ontario. And I'm your host, Annie Bradley. We'll see you next time on Wider Lens. We would like to acknowledge that we are situated in Takaranto and are grateful to be working on this land. We acknowledge the land that we are recording this podcast on today is the colonized territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis. We also acknowledge that Takaranto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. These treaties and other agreements, including the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, are agreements to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We acknowledge and share our gratitude to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada, caregivers of the land, and keepers of its stories for thousands of years.